I slammed my hand on the kitchen counter so hard the coffee mug shattered, because my wife had just told me 3 hours before our flight that she'd invited my stepdaughter's biological father to take my seat on the family vacation I'd spent a year planning. 24 years. 24 years of hospital nights and school pickups and birthday cakes erased in one text message. But here's the twist. Nobody saw coming by the time this story ends the house, the company, the very ground they stood on. None of it would belong to them anymore. If you're watching this from your own city tonight, drop it in the comments and stay with me till the end. Subscribe because this story only gets heavier from here. My hand was still shaking when I picked the broken pieces of the mug off the tile floor. Coffee dripped down the cabinet door in a slow brown line, and I just stood there watching it because it was easier than looking at my phone again. But I looked anyway. I always look. 24 years of marriage teaches you that the pain doesn't go away. If you avoid it, it just waits for you in the dark. Patient until you're alone enough to feel the whole weight of it. The message was still there glowing on the screen, like it was daring me to read it a second time. Richard plans changed. Sophie wants her biological father to come instead. You understand, right? I read it 4 times. 5. Each time I kept waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Something that didn't mean what I knew it meant. They didn't rearrange. They just sat there cold and final like a verdict. My name is Richard Hale. I'm 57 years old, and until 6:23 that morning, I would have told you I had a good marriage, a good family, a good life built brick by brick with my own 2 hands, the same hands that were now bleeding slightly from the broken mug, though I barely noticed. I picked up my phone and typed back 3 words. Just 3. Understand what exactly? The reply came fast. Too fast. Like she'd been waiting phone in hand, ready to defend a decision she'd already made without me. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd built the summer Sophie turned 9, sanding the legs myself in the garage, while she sat on an overturned bucket and handed me tools like a tiny foreman, and I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. As if I was the problem. As if I was the inconvenience standing between them and their happy little vacation. As if 24 years of showing up every single day, every single year, could be swept aside with a text message sent from a hotel room while I stood in the kitchen of the house I built, holding a suitcase I'd already packed. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a man who explodes. I don't throw things. I don't raise my voice. My father used to say that a man who yells has already lost the argument, and I believed him. So when I say I slammed my hand on that counter hard enough to break the mug, understand that it was not rage, it was something worse. It was 24 years of silence finally cracking. I picked up the phone and called Laura. She didn't answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. So I sat there in my kitchen at 6:31 in the morning, and I let myself remember. Not because I wanted to, because I needed to know if I was overreacting. I needed to know if there was some version of this story where I was wrong, where this was a misunderstanding, where in an hour Laura would call back laughing and say, "Of course you're coming. Don't be ridiculous." So I went back, all the way back. I met Laura Bennett when Sophie was 4 years old. Laura was a single mother working 2 jobs, exhausted in a way I'd never seen a person be exhausted. And Sophie was this small, watchful little girl who didn't talk much around strangers. I wasn't a stranger for long. I made her pancakes shaped like animals. I fixed her broken bicycle chain. I read the same 3 books to her every night for what felt like a year until I could recite them in my sleep. By the time she was 5, she started calling me Dad. Nobody told her to. Nobody asked her to. She just did it one evening at dinner so naturally that Laura and I looked at each other across the table, and neither of us said a word, because we both understood something had happened that was bigger than any conversation we could have about it. I never once in 24 years called her my stepdaughter to her face. Not once. She was my daughter. Full stop. No qualifier, no asterisk, no explanation needed for anyone who asked. I was there when she broke her arm falling off the swing set at 7. I was the one who carried her to the car, who sat with her in the emergency room, while Laura was stuck at work, who signed the paperwork, because in that moment I was the only parent she had. I was there for the school plays. I sat in the front row every single time. Even the years she only had one line, even the year she was cast as tree number 2, and stood silently on stage for 40 minutes while I filmed the whole thing on a shaky camcorder like it was the greatest performance in human history. I was there for her first heartbreak at 16, when some boy named Kyle broke up with her over text message 2 days before her homecoming dance. I remember sitting on the edge of her bed while she cried into a pillow, and I didn't say anything wise or profound. I just sat there. I think that's what fathers are supposed to do more than anything else. Just sit there. Just stay. I was there for her college graduation, for the scholarship that fell through her senior year, and the tuition bill that arrived in the mail like a small heart attack, which I paid without telling her, because I didn't want her carrying debt into a life she hadn't even started yet. And through every single one of those moments, every hospital visit, every school night, every heartbreak, every graduation, there was one man who was not there. Nathan Cole. Sophie's biological father left when she was 2. He didn't call on birthdays. He didn't send cards. For 13 years, he was a name Sophie barely mentioned, a photograph in an old shoebox that Laura kept, but never showed her a ghost that didn't haunt anyone because he'd never been present enough to leave a mark. Then about 8 months ago, he came back. I remember the night Laura told me. She sat across from me at this very table, twisting her wedding ring the way she did when she was nervous, and said Nathan had reached out. He'd found Sophie on social media. He wanted to reconnect. He said he'd changed. I remember what I said because I've thought about it every day since. I said, if it makes her happy, then I'm happy for her. I meant it. God help me, I meant every word. I didn't know then that reconnecting would mean slowly, quietly replacing me. I didn't know that every dinner Nathan bought her, every expensive gift, every carefully staged photograph posted online with captions like, "Proud of my daughter." I didn't know all of that was a campaign. A campaign to reclaim a title he'd abandoned 21 years ago, using the tools of a man who understood optics, but had never once understood sacrifice. I sat at that kitchen table, with my phone in my hand, replaying 24 years of my life like a film reel, looking for the moment I'd become disposable. And I couldn't find it. Because there wasn't a moment. It had happened slowly, the way a house settles imperceptibly, one small shift at a time, until one day you notice the doors don't close right anymore, and you realize the whole foundation has moved without you ever feeling it happen. My phone buzzed again. Not Laura. Sophie. Dad, please don't make this a whole thing. It's just one trip. I stared at those words longer than I'd stared at anything in my life. Just one trip. She had no idea. She genuinely had no idea what that trip meant to me because I hadn't told her yet. I hadn't told either of them because I'd been planning to tell them there on the water somewhere far from home, somewhere that felt safe enough to say the words I'd been carrying alone for 3 months. 3 months earlier, I'd sat in a small, sterile office in Denver while a neurologist with kind eyes and a gentle voice used the words early-stage Parkinson's disease. I remember staring at a poster on the wall about hand-eye coordination exercises while the rest of the world seemed to tilt slightly to the left. I remember driving home in silence, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, watching for the tremor the doctor said might already be starting and not seeing it, and being both relieved and terrified by that. I hadn't told Laura. I hadn't told Sophie. I told no one, not because I didn't trust them, but because I wanted just once in my life to carry something difficult on my own for a while before I asked the people I loved to carry it with me. I wanted to understand what I was facing before I let them see me afraid. The vacation was supposed to be the moment I told them. I'd planned every detail of that trip around it, the quiet dinner on the second night, the walk along the water, the words I'd rehearsed in the bathroom mirror more times than I could count. I have something to tell you both, and I need you to know I'm going to be okay, but I need you with me. Instead, I was standing in my kitchen with a suitcase by the door, replaced by a man who had answered none of the calls I'd answered, who had missed every moment I'd shown up for receiving a text message telling me not to make things harder than they needed to be. I picked up the phone one more time. My thumb hovered over Laura's name, and then I did something I had never done in 24 years of marriage. I put the phone down. I didn't call. I didn't beg. I didn't chase. I walked upstairs into the bedroom we'd shared for 2 decades, and I opened the closet where my suitcase sat packed and ready, exactly the way I'd packed it 3 days earlier, with a kind of quiet, hopeful excitement I could barely remember feeling now. I stared at that suitcase for a long time. Then I zipped it back up, carried it to the garage, and set it down in the corner next to the tools my father left me when he died. I went back into the kitchen. I picked up the broken pieces of the mug off the floor one by one, and I set them carefully on the counter like evidence. And then I typed 4 words into my phone. Just 4. I read them twice before I sent them, because I wanted to be sure, really sure, that this was who I was choosing to be. Enjoy the trip. I won't. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. Then I did the one thing I never imagined myself doing in a marriage I'd given my whole adult life to. I opened my contacts, scrolled past Laura's name, past Sophie's name, and found the one person I trusted more than almost anyone else on earth, a man who had drafted every contract for my business for 18 years, who had sat across from me at 100 negotiating tables, who knew the difference between a man who was bluffing and a man who had made up his mind. Martin Hayes. My finger hovered over the call button. For a moment, just a moment, I thought about what I was about to do. I thought about Laura's face, the first time I met her, exhausted and guarded, and still somehow warm. I thought about 5-year-old Sophie calling me Dad for the first time at this very table. I thought about every Christmas morning, every scraped knee, every proud phone call when Sophie got her first job. 24 years doesn't disappear because of one text message. I understood that. I still understand it now looking back. But I also understood something else, something that had been quietly forming in me for months, maybe years, long before that message ever arrived. I understood that a man can love his family with everything he has, and still reach a point where loving them isn't enough to save him from being erased by them. I pressed call. Martin picked up on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. Richard, it's barely 7. Everything okay? I looked out the kitchen window at the sun coming up over the mountains, the same view I'd woken up to for 24 years, and I felt something inside me go very still and very quiet, the way the air feels right before a storm breaks. No, I said. I need you to help me understand something. If I own a piece of property outright bought and paid for before a marriage never signed over, what happens to it if I decide to sell it without telling anyone? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Richard, Martin said slowly, what happened? I looked at the broken pieces of the mug sitting on my counter, at the suitcase now hidden in the garage, at my phone screen, where 4 words sat glowing under a message that would end everything I thought I knew about my life. They chose him, I said. So now I'm choosing me. And for the first time since I'd read that message at 6:23 that morning, my hands stopped shaking. Not because the pain was gone. It wasn't. It was just beginning, and I knew that standing there in my kitchen with coffee still drying on the tile floor. But somewhere underneath the pain, something else had woken up. Something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Clarity. For 24 years I had measured my worth by how much I could give, how much I could carry, fix, provide, endure. I had never once asked what would happen if I simply stopped, if I set the weight down, if I let the people I loved discover all at once exactly how much I had been holding up without them ever noticing. I was about to find out. And so was Nathan Cole, because a title is easy to hand out. Real father. 2 words spoken carelessly in a text message meant to wound. But titles don't pack a suitcase for a sick child at midnight. Titles don't sit in a hospital chair for 2 nights straight. Titles don't quietly pay a tuition bill, so a girl they love never has to know how close she came to carrying that debt alone. Nathan Cole was about to learn the difference between being called a father and being one. And I was about to learn something too. Something I never expected to learn at 57 years old, After 24 years of marriage, standing in a kitchen with a broken mug and a phone call already placed to my lawyer. I was about to learn who I was, when nobody needed me to be anything for them anymore. Martin didn't say anything for a moment after I told him what happened. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and I knew him well enough after 18 years to know exactly what that silence meant. He was already working. His mind had left the sleepy fog of 7 in the morning and gone straight into the place where he lived best. The place where facts mattered more than feelings, where a problem had a structure, and a structure had a solution. "Say that again," he said finally, slowly. So I told him again. The message, the 4 words I sent back. The suitcase I carried to the garage instead of the car. I told him about the property, the house on Larkspur Ridge, the one I bought 2 years before I ever met Laura, back when I was 28 years old, and had nothing but a used truck, a bank loan, and more stubbornness than sense. "You never put her name on it," Martin said. It wasn't a question. He already knew the answer. He'd drafted the paperwork for half my properties over the years, and he remembered things about my business better than I remembered them myself. "No," I said. "Never refinanced it jointly. Never added her to the deed." "No." There was a pause, and I could picture him exactly sitting up now, probably in his kitchen too, reaching for a pen out of habit, even though this wasn't the kind of conversation you take notes on with a pen. "Richard," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about the answer before you give it to me. Are you doing this because you're angry, or are you doing this because you've already decided?" I looked at the counter at the shattered pieces of the coffee mug I still hadn't thrown away. Sophie had given me that mug for Father's Day when she was 11 years old. It had a crooked hand-painted fish on it that she'd made in an after-school pottery class, and the handle had always been a little too small for my hand, and I had used it every single morning for the last 13 years because I loved it more than any mug that actually fit right. "The message was emotional," I said. "The decision wasn't. I've been disappearing out of that family for a long time, Martin. I just didn't want to admit it until this morning." He exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said. "Then let's talk about what you actually want to do, because there's a difference between protecting yourself and burning something down, and I need to know which one this is before I help you." "I don't want to hurt them," I said, and even as I said it, some small, tired, honest part of me wondered if that was completely true. "I want to stop being erased. That's it. That's all I want." "Then here's what we do," Martin said, and his voice shifted into the tone he used in boardrooms, calm and precise, the tone that had made men twice his size back down at negotiating tables. "The house on Larkspur Ridge is yours. Fully yours. No claim Laura could make on it would hold up, not after everything we structured back when you two got married. Remember the post-nuptial agreement back in year 3, when you were expanding the company and needed clean separation between business assets and marital assets?" I remembered. Laura had agreed to it without hesitation at the time, had actually been the one to suggest we get everything properly organized, so that if anything ever happened to the business, her and Sophie's security wouldn't be tied up in a legal mess. I remembered feeling grateful back then that she cared enough to think that far ahead. I hadn't thought about that agreement in nearly 2 decades. I hadn't needed to. "That agreement protects you completely," Martin continued. "You can sell that house tomorrow if you want to, and there is nothing legally that anyone can do to stop you." "Then that's what I want to do," I said. "Richard." His voice softened just slightly. "Once you do this, there's no quiet way to undo it. You understand that?" I looked out the kitchen window again. The sun had fully risen now, spilling gold across the counter, across the broken mug, across the suitcase-shaped space by the door where my bag should have been sitting, ready for a trip that was supposed to change everything in a very different way than it was about to. "I understand," I said. "Do it." We talked for another 40 minutes. Martin walked me through the timeline, how quickly he could get a realtor out, how fast a cash sale could move if I was willing to price it to sell in days instead of months, how to arrange storage for the belongings inside so that nothing would be lost, nothing damaged, nothing treated with anything less than care, even as I dismantled the life we'd built inside those walls. "You're not doing this to hurt them," Martin said again near the end of the call, like he needed to hear himself say it as much as I needed to hear it. You're doing this because for 24 years you gave everything, and the one time you needed something back, they told you not to make it harder than it needed to be. I didn't answer right away. I was staring at my phone where Sophie's text still sat glowing at the top of my messages. Dad, please don't make this a whole thing. It's just one trip. Martin, I said. There's something else, something I haven't told either of them yet. I told him about the diagnosis, about the neurologist's office in Denver, the poster about hand-eye coordination, the drive home where I gripped the wheel too tight, watching for a tremor that hadn't started yet. I told him I'd been planning to tell Laura and Sophie on that trip, the trip they'd just uninvited me from. Martin was quiet for a long time. Richard, he finally said, and his voice had changed completely, all the lawyer gone out of it, just an old friend left behind. I'm so sorry. Don't be, I said. I'm handling it. I've got a good doctor. Early intervention. I'll be okay for a long time yet. But Martin, that's what makes this so much worse. I wasn't going to ask them for pity. I wasn't even going to ask them for help. Not really. I just wanted them to know. I wanted my family in the room when I said the words out loud for the first time. And instead, I stopped. I couldn't finish the sentence because finishing it meant admitting something I wasn't ready to say yet, even to myself. Instead, they gave my seat to a man who had spent 21 years proving he didn't want to be in any room with any of us at all. Get some rest, Martin said quietly. I'll start the paperwork this morning. I'll have a realtor at the house by tomorrow if you want to move that fast. I want to move that fast, I said. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not moving, just breathing, listening to the refrigerator hum and the old clock on the wall tick through minutes that felt heavier than any minutes I could remember living through before. And that's when the memories really started coming. Not the pleasant, curated ones I'd been telling myself all morning to justify what I was about to do, although those were true too, every one of them. These were sharper, uglier. The ones I usually didn't let myself think about because thinking about them made the last several years feel less like a slow drift and more like something that had been happening to me on purpose, piece by piece, for longer than I wanted to admit. I thought about Sophie's 8th birthday, when she woke up with a fever that spiked so fast, Laura panicked and called me at a job site 40 minutes away, and I dropped a framing crew mid-project and drove like a man possessed to get to that emergency room. I thought about sitting in a hard plastic chair for 2 straight nights while doctors ran tests, while Laura cried in the hallway, while Sophie, small and pale and scared, reached for my hand instead of her mother's, because I was the one sitting closest, because I was the one who never left. Nathan didn't call once. Not that week, not that month. I don't think he even knew it happened. Laura told me later she hadn't bothered telling him, because what would have been the point? I thought about Sophie's junior year of college, when her academic scholarship quietly evaporated because of a paperwork error on the university's end that took 3 semesters to untangle, and a tuition bill for $11,000 landed in the mailbox, like a bomb nobody had warned us was coming. I remembered Laura's face when she opened it, the color draining out of her, the 2 of us sitting at this same kitchen table, doing math that didn't work no matter how many times we ran it. I paid it. Quietly. I never told Sophie. I didn't want her carrying the weight of it into finals week, didn't want her feeling like a burden to anyone. So I transferred the money and told Laura to tell the school it had been resolved, and that was the end of it, as far as anyone else needed to know. I thought about Sophie's graduation 18 months later, and how Nathan showed up in a suit that probably cost more than my truck hair. Combed smile, perfect, hugging Sophie in front of everyone for photographs, saying things like, "So proud of you, kid," to a chorus of applause from people who had no idea he hadn't paid a single dollar toward the education he was now taking credit for admiring. I stood in the back of those photographs. Every single one. Not because anyone told me to, because somewhere along the way I had started believing that was where I belonged in the background, useful, unseen, holding the family together from the edges of the frame while someone else stood in the center collecting the credit. My phone buzzed again. I flinched. I actually flinched, like the sound itself might hurt me. I looked down, half expecting another message from Sophie, Another plea to not make this a whole thing. It was Laura. "Richard, what do you mean, enjoy the trip? I won't. Are you being serious right now?" I stared at the words for a long time before I typed anything back. I thought about everything Martin and I had just discussed. I thought about the post-nuptial agreement, the house, the timeline we'd sketched out over the phone. I thought about how easy it would be to write back something cruel, something that matched the sting of what she'd sent me 3 hours earlier. I thought about how easy it would be to write back something desperate, begging her to reconsider, to choose me to remember 24 years in the space of a single text message. I did neither. I typed, yes. That was all. One word. I hit send and set the phone face down on the table, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't wait anxiously for the reply. I didn't refresh, didn't check, didn't sit there with my stomach in knots, wondering what she'd say back. Because for the first time in 24 years, her reply didn't matter as much as what I had already decided to do. The phone buzzed 3 more times over the next 10 minutes. I didn't look. I got up, walked out to the garage, and stood there staring at my father's old toolbox sitting in the corner. The one thing in that entire house that had never once been touched by anyone but me. My father built houses for 31 years before his heart gave out on a job site when I was 26. He used to say something to me when I was a kid, something I hadn't thought about in years. And standing there in that garage, it came back to me so clearly, it was almost like hearing his voice again. "Richard," he used to say, wiping sawdust off his hands with a rag that never actually got them clean. "A house isn't a home because of the walls. It's a home because of who chooses to stay inside it. Walls don't choose anything. People do." I hadn't understood what he meant when I was 17 years old, rolling my eyes at what felt like just another one of his tired sayings. I understood it now, standing in a garage at 57, having just told my lawyer to start the paperwork to sell the very walls my father had helped me pour the foundation for back before I even had a family to fill them with. The people hadn't chosen to stay. So maybe the walls didn't need to stay either. My phone rang. Not a text this time. A call. Laura. I let it ring twice before I answered, and when I did, I didn't say hello. I just held the phone to my ear and waited. "Richard?" Her voice was tight controlled the way it always got when she was upset and trying very hard not to show it. "What is going on? Sophie said you're being weird. What does 'I won't' mean?" "It means I'm not coming on the trip," I said. "Obviously," she snapped. "I got that part. I'm asking why you're being like this. It's one trip, Richard. Sophie wants a chance to know her father. I thought you of all people would understand that." Something in me went very still. "I do understand it," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I understand wanting to know your father. I understand it completely, Laura, because I spent 24 years being one. Every single day of it. I understand it so well that I don't need anyone to explain it to me." "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Silence. I could hear her breathing, could picture her standing somewhere in the hotel room they'd checked into near the airport the night before, probably pacing, probably running a hand through her hair, the way she always did when she was cornered by something she hadn't fully thought through. "I meant," she said finally, more carefully, "that Nathan is trying. He's really trying. Richard and Sophie deserves the chance to build that relationship, and I thought you'd be understanding about it because that's who you are. You're the understanding one. You always have been." There it was. The word that had defined me for 24 years, spoken now like an accusation, like an expectation, like a role I was contractually obligated to keep playing, no matter what it cost me. The understanding one. "Laura?" I said quietly. "Do you know what I was going to tell you on that trip?" "What?" I closed my eyes. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 3 months ago. The silence that followed was different than any silence I'd ever heard from her in 24 years of marriage. It had weight to it. I could hear it pressing through the phone. "What?" she said again, but this time it was barely a whisper. "Early stage," I said. I've got a good doctor. I've been managing it quietly, doing my research, figuring out what my life looks like from here, because I wanted to understand it myself before I asked you and Sophie to carry it with me. I planned that whole trip around telling you both. I picked the resort because it had a quiet beach at sunset, and I thought that would be the right place to say it. I had it all planned out, Laura. Every word. Richard, and instead, I said. And for the first time all morning, my voice cracked just slightly, just enough that I had to stop and breathe before I could keep going. Instead, I got a text message at 6 in the morning telling me my seat had been given to a man who has spent 21 years proving he didn't want it. I didn't know, she said, and her voice was shaking now too. Richard, I swear to you, I had no idea. If I had known, you would have what? I asked. Waited until after the trip to replace me instead of before it. That's not fair. None of this is fair, I said. But it's happening anyway. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, gone smaller, more uncertain. What are you saying? Richard, are we? Is this you telling me you want a divorce? I looked around the garage at the toolbox at the empty space where the suitcase should have been sitting in the trunk of the car. We should have been loading right now at the doorway, leading back into the kitchen, where a mug with a crooked hand-painted fish lay in pieces on the counter. I'm telling you, I said slowly, that I already called my lawyer this morning, before you called me. I'm telling you that I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left being the man who's understood everyone else's needs and never once had his own needs understood back. Richard, wait. I have to go, Laura. Richard, please just wait. Let's talk about this like adults. Let's not do anything we can't take back. I already did, I said, this morning, before 6:30. I hung up. I stood in that garage for a long time after that phone in hand, waiting for the flood of panic I expected to feel, the second guessing the urge to call her back, and take it all back, and beg for one more chance to be understood. It didn't come. Instead, something settled over me that felt almost like relief, thin and fragile, but real. The phone rang again almost immediately. I looked at the screen. Sophie. I stared at her name for a long moment. 21 years of memories flashed behind my eyes in the space of about 3 seconds. Pigtails and skinned knees, a homemade Father's Day card, with glitter glue that never fully dried, a girl in a cap and gown. Hugging a man who wasn't wearing the expensive suit. Hugging me instead, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Dad," into my shoulder before she even knew I'd paid off her tuition, before she knew about any of it. Just because some part of her already understood, even if she couldn't articulate it yet. I answered, "Dad?" Her voice was small, scared, nothing like the slightly annoyed text message she'd sent me an hour earlier. "Mom just told me what you said, about your diagnosis. Dad, is that true?" "It's true," I said gently. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice broke on the last word. "Why would you keep something like that from me?" "Because I wanted to tell you the right way," I said. "On that trip. I had a whole plan, Sophie. I wanted to sit down with you and your mother somewhere quiet and tell you both together, and I wanted to be able to answer every question you had, and I wanted you to know I was going to be okay before you had time to be scared. So instead you found out we replaced you and you didn't say anything," she said, and I could hear her crying. Now could hear the particular quality of tears that come from realizing you've hurt someone you love without meaning to. "Dad, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know any of this. Nathan's been reaching out and he keeps saying things like he wants to make up for lost time, and I guess I got caught up in wanting that to be real, and I didn't think about what it would mean for you. I didn't think, Sophie. And now you're telling me you're sick, and I made you feel like you didn't matter on top of everything. And I don't even know what to say. I don't know how to fix this." "Sophie," I said again, firmer this time, and she stopped. "I need you to hear something, and I need you to really hear it, not just listen to it." "Okay," she whispered. "This isn't about one trip," I said. "This has been building for a long time, longer than you probably realize. I don't say that to make you feel guilty. I say it because I need you to understand that this morning wasn't the cause. It was just the moment I finally saw clearly what had already been happening. What do you mean? I thought about how to answer that standing in the garage, my father's toolbox at my feet, my hand resting absently against the door of the truck I'd driven to that hospital 14 years earlier when she spiked a fever that nearly took her from us. I mean, I said slowly, that somewhere along the way showing up stopped being enough as long as someone else was showing up louder. I mean that I have spent your whole life in the background of your photographs, and I told myself that was fine, because I didn't need to be seen, I just needed you to be happy. But this morning, I realized something. Being needed and being wanted are two different things, Sophie. I have always known I was needed. This morning, for the first time, I understood that maybe I was never really wanted. Not the way I wanted to be. She didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear her crying softly on the other end, and every instinct I had, every fatherly instinct built over 21 years, screamed at me to apologize, to take it back, to tell her it was fine, to make her stop crying the way I always had. I didn't. "Where are you going to go?" she finally asked in a small voice. "Mom said you called a lawyer. What does that mean, Dad? Are you leaving us?" I closed my eyes. "I already left," I said quietly. "This morning at 6:23. I just didn't know it yet until I read that message. Dad, please don't do anything permanent. Please. Just come home when we get back and we'll talk, all three of us. We'll figure this out. Sophie." I said, "I love you. I need you to know that nothing about what's happening changes that. Nothing ever will. But I can't come home to a place where showing up my whole life only earned me a seat that could be given away in a text message. I'm sorry. I really am. Dad, I have to go," I said. "I love you, Sophie." I hung up before she could say anything else, because I knew if I stayed on that call one more minute, I would cave. I would tell her it didn't matter. I would drive to the airport and get on that flight and spend the next 10 days smiling in photographs from the background. While Nathan Cole collected 2 decades of credit, he never earned all because I couldn't bear the sound of my daughter crying. But I had already told Martin to start the paperwork. And somewhere deep down underneath the grief and the guilt and the aching familiar urge to fix everything for everyone, the way I always had, I knew that if I turned back now, I would spend the rest of whatever years I had left as a ghost in my own life, understood by no one, needed by everyone, and slowly, quietly disappearing. My phone rang 3 more times over the next hour. Laura twice, Sophie once. I let all 3 go to voicemail. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee in a plain, ordinary mug from the back of the cabinet, and I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad Martin had told me to start filling with a full inventory of the house, every piece of furniture, every belonging, everything that would need to be carefully packed and stored, so that nothing, absolutely nothing, would be damaged or lost in the process. Around 11 that morning, my phone buzzed one more time. A text, not from Laura, not from Sophie, from Nathan. I stared at his name on my screen for a long moment. We had met exactly twice in the 8 months since he'd reappeared, both times brief, both times painfully polite, both times ending with a handshake that felt like 2 men measuring each other without either one admitting it. I hadn't given him my number. I assumed Laura had. I opened the message. "Richard, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Nobody's trying to replace you. Laura mentioned you were upset. I just want Sophie to have a chance to know me. I hope we can be adults about this." I read it twice. Then a third time. "I just want Sophie to have a chance to know me." 21 years, and that was the sentence he chose. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement of what he'd missed, what he'd cost, what he'd never once shown up for. Just a request phrased like a kindness for the chance to collect the credit for a childhood he'd contributed nothing to. I set the phone down without answering. Instead, I picked up the legal pad and kept writing. Room by room, item by item. The dining table Sophie did her homework on for 12 years. The bookshelf full of the paperback mysteries Laura used to read, curled up on the couch. The framed photograph from Sophie's college graduation, where I stood in the back of the shot, half out of frame, smiling anyway. Every item I wrote down felt like closing a door, not slamming it, just closing it quietly, deliberately, the way you close a door on a room you know you won't be walking back into for a very long time. Around 1 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the front door. I opened it, expecting Martin, expecting the realtor, expecting almost anyone except who was actually standing there. My neighbor, Ellen Whitfield, 71 years old, widowed 6 years, the kind of woman who noticed everything on our street and generally kept it to herself unless it mattered. "Richard," she said, studying my face with the particular sharpness of someone who had lived through enough of her own hard mornings to recognize one on someone else. I saw the car still in the driveway. Laura mentioned the trip weeks ago. "Everything all right, dear?" I looked at her for a long moment, and something in me, something that had been holding very still all morning, finally cracked just slightly, just enough that my voice wasn't quite steady when I answered. "No," I said honestly. "Not really. But it's going to be." She didn't ask for details. She just nodded slowly, the way people do when they've lived long enough to understand that some mornings don't need explaining. They just need witnessing. "Well," she said gently, "if you need anything, I'm right next door. I mean that, Richard." "Thank you, Ellen." She left, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the street, at the house across the way, at the quiet, ordinary Tuesday morning, unfolding around me, like nothing at all had changed, even though everything had. I went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and picked up the legal pad again. And as I wrote item by item, room by room, I realized something that settled into my chest, with a strange, quiet certainty. I wasn't destroying my family. I was finally, for the first time in 24 years, choosing myself. And somewhere on a cruise ship, pulling away from a Florida dock that afternoon, my wife, my daughter, and the man being called her real father had absolutely no idea what they were sailing away from. The realtor Martin sent showed up at 9 the next morning. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Prescott, who had sold 3 of my commercial properties over the years, and never once asked a question she didn't need the answer to. She walked through the house with a tablet in her hand, tapping notes, and when she finished the walkthrough, she looked at me and said one sentence that stuck with me the rest of the day. "Richard, a house this well built sells itself. I could have 3 offers by Friday." "Price it to move," I told her. "I don't need top dollar. I need it done." She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She'd worked with me long enough to know that when I said something plainly, I meant it plainly, and arguing with me about it would only waste both our time. By that afternoon, a moving crew Martin had arranged was already boxing up the house room by room, working off the inventory list I'd handwritten the day before. I stood in the living room and watched strangers wrap Sophie's childhood artwork in packing paper, watched them lift the dining table I'd built with my own hands, and carry it out the front door, like it was nothing more than furniture, which I suppose to them it was. To me, it was 12 years of homework help. It was Thanksgiving mornings. It was the night Sophie came home from her first heartbreak and sat at that table eating ice cream straight from the carton, while I sat across from her saying nothing, just being there, because sometimes being there is the only thing that matters. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect this part of the story to be full of tears, and it wasn't. What I felt instead was something stranger, a kind of quiet, aching clarity, like watching a life you used to live from just outside a window, close enough to see everything far enough that none of it could touch you anymore. My phone had been ringing all day. Laura 6 times, Sophie 4 times. I let every single call go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I knew myself well enough to know that the sound of either of their voices, live and pleading, would undo everything I'd built up the courage to do. Around 6 that evening, sitting in a hotel room, I'd checked into an hour earlier, because I couldn't bring myself to sleep one more night in a house that was already being disassembled around me. I finally listened to the voicemails. All 10 of them back to back in order. Laura's first message was angry. "Richard, this is insane. You can't just sell our house. Call me back right now." Her second was different, quieter. "I talked to Martin's office. They said the house was never in my name. Richard is. Is that true? 24 years, and I never even knew that." I sat on the edge of that hotel bed and let that message play twice, because something in her voice on the second listen surprised me. It wasn't rage anymore. It was something closer to fear. Sophie's messages were worse to listen to, because Sophie had never learned to hide what she was feeling, not the way her mother had. "Dad, please, please call me back. I don't understand what's happening. Mom's crying and I don't know what any of this means. Are you really selling the house? Where am I supposed to go when I come visit?" That last question hit me harder than anything else that entire week. Where am I supposed to go when I come visit? As if the house had only ever been a place she visited. As if, without meaning to, she'd already told me the truth about how much I had let myself become background scenery in her life. I didn't call back that night either. I told myself I needed one more day. In reality, I think I was scared that if I heard either of their voices live unfiltered, I would drive straight back to Fort Collins and undo everything. And some deep, tired part of me knew that if I did that, I would spend the rest of my life the exact same way I'd spent the last several years necessary, but never chosen. The offers on the house came in faster than even Diane expected. By Thursday morning, 3 days after I'd made the call to Martin, we had 2 offers above asking price. I picked the cleanest one, a young couple expecting their first child cash offer. No contingencies, closing in 12 days. 12 days. I remember staring at that number on the contract Martin emailed me and feeling something strange settle in my chest. 12 days to end 24 years. That same afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, I looked at the screen and saw a number I didn't recognize, a Florida area code. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit, but something made me answer. "Richard Hale." A man's voice, unfamiliar, clipped professional. "Speaking. This is Gary Whitmore. I'm the excursion coordinator for the cruise line. I'm calling because there seems to be some confusion with your booking. We have 4 names listed for the shore excursion package tomorrow in Cozumel, but the payment method on file was declined this morning. I was told to call the primary account holder." I closed my eyes. The primary account holder. Me. I had booked and paid for that entire trip months ago, the excursions, the private dinner reservation, the couple's spa package I'd arranged as a surprise for Laura's birthday, which happened to fall during the cruise. I had canceled the card that morning, the same card attached to nearly every reservation on that trip, without even thinking about what that would actually mean for the people currently sailing on it. "Cancel it," I said. "All of it. I won't be paying for any of it going forward." There was a pause on the line. "Understood, sir. I'll let the other guests know there's been a change." I hung up and sat there for a long moment, feeling something I wasn't proud of, and also couldn't quite make myself regret. It wasn't cruelty. I want to be clear about that. It was simply the natural consequence of removing myself from a life I had for 24 years, financially and emotionally held together with both hands. I hadn't thought about the ripple effects. I was starting to understand there would be many. My phone buzzed almost immediately. "Laura, Richard, our excursions just got canceled. The dinner reservation, everything. What is wrong with you?" I stared at that message for a long time before typing back, and when I finally did, I kept it simple. I paid for a trip I was invited on and then uninvited from. I'm not required to keep funding a vacation I'm not attending. Her reply came fast, and I could feel the panic bleeding through the screen, even in text form. "This isn't just about the excursions, Richard. Sophie's card got declined at dinner tonight, in front of Nathan. Do you understand how humiliating that was for her?" I read that message twice, and something in me, something old and tired and endlessly responsible, almost typed back an apology. Almost. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Then I thought about Sophie's text from 3 days earlier. "Dad, please don't make this a whole thing. It's just one trip." I thought about being replaced in a message sent while I stood by a suitcase with a year of planning behind it. I thought about the tuition I'd quietly paid, the hospital nights, the school plays, 24 years of being the invisible hand that made everything work. I typed back 4 words, the same 4 I'd sent 3 days earlier, except this time, they meant something different. I understand completely now. I turned my phone face down and didn't look at it again that night. The next morning, Martin called with news that changed the shape of everything. "Richard, I need you sitting down for this." I'm sitting. The buyers want to close early. They're pre-approved. They've got the cash ready, and their agent is pushing for a 7-day close instead of 12. Can you have everything out of the house by Tuesday? 7 days. I did the math almost without meaning to. The cruise was 10 days total. If we closed in 7, the house would belong to someone else 3 days before Laura, Sophie, and Nathan even made it back to Fort Collins. Something about that timeline felt less like coincidence, and more like the universe finishing a sentence I'd started. "Do it," I said. The next several days moved faster than I expected grief to allow. Though I suppose that's the strange mercy of staying busy. It doesn't erase the pain, but it gives you somewhere to put your hands while you carry it. I spent those days at the storage facility personally overseeing the placement of every box, every piece of furniture, making absolutely certain that nothing was damaged or lost. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I kept telling myself that over and over, like a man repeating a prayer he wasn't sure he still believed. I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply refusing to keep building a home for people who had already told me in the clearest way they knew how that I wasn't part of the picture they were building for themselves. On the 5th day, standing in the nearly empty house, I found something I hadn't expected to find. Tucked behind a loose board in the garage, a hiding spot only I knew about. Built the same summer I built the kitchen table, was a small wooden box I'd made when Sophie was 9 years old. Inside it were things I'd forgotten I'd kept. A photograph of her on her 9th birthday, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on my shoulders at a county fair. A movie ticket stub from the first film we ever saw together, just the two of us, while Laura worked a double shift. A folded piece of paper, her 9-year-old handwriting uneven and earnest. "Dear Dad, thank you for teaching me how to ride my bike. You didn't let go even when I told you to. I love you the mostest. Love, Sophie." I sat down on the garage floor, an almost 60-year-old man surrounded by empty walls and packed boxes, and I read that note 4 times. "You didn't let go, even when I told you to." I thought about the last several days. I thought about a text message telling me to enjoy a trip alone. I thought about a phone call I hadn't fully returned. I thought about the fact that for the first time in 21 years, I was the one letting go, and Sophie, somewhere on a boat in the middle of the ocean, had no idea it was happening. I kept that box. It went into my own truck, not into storage. Along with my father's toolbox, a single photograph of Sophie at 9 years old that I'd already set aside separately, the first wooden chair I ever built when my company was nothing but a name and a dream, and a manila folder holding every medical record from the last 3 months. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the framed photographs I'd stood in the background of for 2 decades, went into a climate-controlled storage unit 40 minutes outside of town, fully paid, fully insured, waiting for whenever Laura and Sophie decided to claim it. The house closed on a Tuesday morning. I stood in the empty living room one last time before handing the keys to Diane, and I let myself feel it, really feel it, for the first time since that message arrived 6 days earlier. 29 years of my life gone in the space of a single signature. I'd bought that land at 28 alone with nothing but a loan and a truck. I was leaving it at 57 alone again, but this time by choice, carrying a box of childhood memories and a folder of medical paperwork instead of a suitcase for a vacation I never got to take. "You okay, Richard?" Diane asked gently, watching my face. "No," I said honestly. "But I will be." I moved into a small lakeside cabin about 90 minutes outside Fort Collins that same afternoon. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms and a porch that looked out over still water, a place Martin had found for me through a client who needed a fast, quiet rental. I unpacked exactly 4 boxes. It didn't take long. That night, sitting on the porch with a beer, I barely touched my phone, finally rang with a call I couldn't ignore any longer. Laura. Live, not a voicemail. I stared at the screen for 3 full rings before I answered. "Richard." Her voice was hollow, stripped of the anger from the last several days, replaced by something that sounded almost like disbelief. "We just got back. The house, Richard. There's a family moving in. There's a moving truck in the driveway. I thought Martin was bluffing. I thought you were bluffing." "I don't bluff, Laura. You know that about me." "Where's our stuff? Where are we supposed to go?" "Everything's in storage," I said calmly. "Climate-controlled, fully insured, completely intact. Martin's office has all the paperwork. Nothing was lost. Nothing was damaged." "That's not what I asked you," she said, and her voice cracked. "I asked where we're supposed to go. Sophie's standing here crying in a driveway that doesn't belong to us anymore. Richard and I don't know what to tell her." I closed my eyes and pressed the phone harder against my ear. And for one weak, aching moment, every instinct I'd spent 24 years building screamed at me to fix it. Find them a place. Call a hotel. Solve the problem the way I always had, the way I'd solved every problem for this family since the year Sophie turned 5 years old. I didn't. I'm not the one who has to figure that out anymore, I said quietly. "I'm sorry, Laura, I really am. But I think it's time somebody else in this family learned how to hold something up." There was a long silence, and in the background, I could hear Sophie crying, and Nathan's voice low and uncertain saying something I couldn't make out. "Is that him?" I asked. "Is he there with you right now?" "Richard, please don't. Ask him where the family's staying tonight," I said. "Ask him if he's got a place ready. Ask him if he knows Sophie's allergic to shellfish, or that she can't sleep without a fan running, or that she hates sleeping in a room with the closet door open, always has since she was 6 years old, and swore something lived inside it. Ask him if he knows any of that, Laura, because I do, and I think that's the difference between a title and a father." She didn't answer. I could hear her breathing shaky and uneven, and somewhere behind her, Sophie's crying got louder. "I have to go," I said gently. "Take care of yourselves." I hung up before she could respond, and I sat there on that porch for a long time, watching the last light fade off the lake, listening to nothing but water and wind, feeling for the first time in 6 days, something that wasn't quite peace, but was standing very close to it. My phone buzzed one more time before I finally set it down for the night. Not Laura, not Sophie, Martin. "Just got a call from the buyer's agent. Everything closed clean. You did the right thing, Richard. I know it doesn't feel like it yet, but you did." I looked out over the dark water and thought about my father standing in that garage decades ago wiping sawdust off his hands. A house isn't a home because of the walls. It's a home because of who chooses to stay inside it. Nobody had chosen to stay. Not really. Not the way I had for 24 years without ever once being asked if I wanted to. But sitting there that night, alone in a small cabin by a quiet lake, carrying nothing but a box of memories, a folder of medical records, and the bruised, uncertain beginning of something that felt almost like freedom, I understood something I hadn't been able to see clearly in years. I hadn't lost my family that week. I had simply stopped being the only one required to hold it together. And somewhere back in Fort Collins, standing in a driveway that no longer belonged to them, watching a moving truck pull away with someone else's furniture, Laura and Sophie were about to discover exactly how much weight I had been carrying for them all along, and exactly how heavy it felt now that they had to carry it themselves. The weeks that followed moved slower than the ones before them, and in a strange way that slowness was harder to carry than all the chaos of that first week combined. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a man once the paperwork is signed, once the boxes are stored, once the phone finally stops ringing every few hours. It's the silence of consequence. The noise of a decision finally catching up with the man who made it. I filled my days the only way I knew how with work. I still had. The company still had crews out on job sites across 3 counties. Still had a business that didn't care whether its owner had just walked away from 24 years of marriage. I threw myself into it the way I used to throw myself into fixing everyone else's problems, except now there was nobody left at home waiting for me to come back and be someone different than the man who'd spent all day solving other people's crises. Martin checked in every few days, mostly to make sure I was eating, mostly to make sure I wasn't sitting alone in that cabin doing something foolish with all the silence. I appreciated it more than I let on. 18 years of business together, and it turned out he'd become something closer to a brother than a lawyer somewhere along the way, though neither of us would have said that out loud. "You look like hell," he told me bluntly the third week, standing on my porch with 2 coffees and a bag of pastries he'd clearly bought because he didn't trust me to feed myself properly. "Thanks," I said. "You always know just what to say." "I'm serious, Richard. You've lost weight. When's the last time you slept a full night?" I didn't answer because the honest answer was somewhere around 6 weeks, and I didn't want to hear what he'd say about that. Instead, I handed him the second coffee and sat down on the porch steps, looking out over water that had become the only consistently calm thing in my life. "How's Laura?" I finally asked. "You still handling the settlement paperwork?" "She's struggling," Martin said carefully. "The divorce filing surprised her more than I think she expected it to. I don't think she fully believed you'd go through with any of this until the papers actually arrived." "And Sophie?" Martin looked at me for a long moment before answering the way a man looks at someone he's trying to protect from something he already knows is coming. "She's asked about you. A lot, actually. She's called my office twice trying to get information about how you're doing." I told her that wasn't something I could share. I nodded slowly, feeling something twist in my chest that I didn't examine too closely. "And Nathan?" Martin's jaw tightened slightly. "That's actually part of why I came out here today." I looked up at him. "What happened?" Martin sat down beside me on the steps, and I could tell from the way he was choosing his words that whatever he was about to tell me had been sitting on him for a while. "Word around town," he said slowly, "is that things aren't exactly smooth between Nathan and Sophie. From what I've heard, and Richard, this is secondhand, so take it for what it's worth. Nathan's been struggling to actually step into the role he spent 8 months campaigning for." "Meaning what?" "Meaning showing up for a photograph is different than showing up for a life," Martin said. "I heard he missed Sophie's follow-up dentist appointment last month because he had a golf outing with some old college buddies. I heard he forgot she doesn't eat pork, served it at a family dinner he was hosting, didn't even remember it was something you'd known since she was 6 years old." I said nothing. I just stared out at the water, feeling something complicated move through me. Not satisfaction exactly. I didn't want to feel satisfaction over Sophie's pain over Nathan failing her, the way he'd been failing her for 2 decades before he ever tried playing catch-up. But underneath the discomfort was something else, something quieter, something that felt almost like validation for 24 years of showing up nobody had ever fully acknowledged. "There's something else," Martin said, and his voice dropped lower. "Sophie's had some health issues recently. Nothing serious from what I understand, but stress-related. She's been struggling since the divorce started. Laura mentioned it to my paralegal when she came in to sign some documents last week. Apparently Sophie's barely eating, not sleeping well." My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with 21 years of instinct I couldn't simply turn off because I'd moved out of a house. "Is she okay?" "I don't know, Richard. I'm not her doctor. I'm just telling you what I heard because I thought you should know, and because, frankly, I think some part of you needed to hear that walking away didn't make this easy for anyone. Not even you." I sat with that for a long time after Martin left that afternoon. I thought about calling Sophie. I picked up my phone 3 separate times that evening and stared at her name in my contacts, my thumb hovering over the call button each time before setting the phone back down. It wasn't that I didn't want to call her. God, I wanted to. Every instinct in me wanted to drive back to Fort Collins that very night and sit across from her and ask her what was wrong and fix it the way I'd fixed everything for 21 years. But some harder, more honest part of me understood that if I did that now, if I rushed back in the moment things got difficult for her, I would be teaching her something I didn't want her to learn. That my boundaries were negotiable the second someone I loved was hurting. That 24 years of being replaceable could be undone with one crisis, one tearful phone call, one moment of need. I had spent my whole life being needed. I was trying for the first time to learn what it meant to also be respected. So instead of calling, I did something different. I started the thing I'd been quietly thinking about since the week I moved into that cabin. A scholarship fund for young tradespeople, kids who wanted to learn carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. Kids who had the hands and the will, but not the money to get proper training. I'd built my entire company from nothing, from a loan and a truck and more stubbornness than sense, and somewhere in the wreckage of my own life falling apart, I found myself wanting to build something that would outlast whatever was left of me. I called it the Hale Foundation for Trade Apprenticeships, not for recognition. I didn't put my name on a building or take out an ad in the local paper. I just quietly funded it, worked with the community college to set up a proper apprenticeship pipeline. Personally interviewed the first 6 kids who applied. There was a boy named Marcus, 19 years old, working 2 jobs to support his mother and younger sister, who showed up to his interview in a shirt that was clearly borrowed and too big for him, hands shaking with nerves. I saw myself in him so clearly, it nearly took my breath away. A young man trying to build something out of nothing, terrified nobody was going to give him the chance to prove what he was capable of. I gave him the chance. I gave 5 others the same chance. And for the first time in months, doing something for someone else didn't feel like disappearing into the background. It felt like choosing deliberately who I wanted to show up for. 2 months into the Foundation's first apprenticeship cohort, I got a call I wasn't expecting. Sophie. I stared at her name for 3 full rings before answering, my heart doing something complicated and painful in my chest. Dad. Her voice was thin-tired, nothing like the confident young woman I remembered from her graduation photos. I heard about the scholarship program. Someone at the community college mentioned it. They didn't know I was your daughter. They were just talking about how amazing it was that somebody was finally helping kids who couldn't afford trade school. It's something I wanted to do, I said carefully. It's exactly like you, she said, and I could hear her voice cracking slightly. It's exactly the kind of thing you do quietly without telling anyone, without needing credit. I didn't say anything because I didn't trust my own voice not to break. Dad, can we talk? Not about the divorce. Not about the house. I miss you. I miss talking to you. I don't know how to explain how much I miss you. I closed my eyes, feeling months of carefully built resolve wavering under the weight of her voice. I'd like that, I said quietly. But Sophie, I need you to know something before we do. I'm not coming back to how things were. I love you. That's never going to change. But I'm not going back to being invisible in my own family, even for you. I know, she whispered. Dad, I know. I've had a lot of time to think about everything. About what I said. About what I let happen. I was so caught up in wanting Nathan to be something he clearly wasn't ever going to be, and I didn't think about what that meant for you, what it cost you. And I am so sorry, I don't even know how to start apologizing for. Sophie, I said gently, breathe. She laughed, a wet, broken sound. I forgot how you always used to say that, every time I got worked up about something as a kid. Some habits don't change, I said. And for the first time in months, I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly. We talked for almost an hour that night. She told me about Nathan, about missed appointments, forgotten details, a relationship that looked perfect in photographs and felt hollow in practice. She told me she'd started therapy, that her doctor had flagged some concerning patterns around stress and eating, that she was working on it slowly, one day at a time. She told me Laura had been struggling too, that the divorce had forced her mother to confront things about herself she'd apparently spent years avoiding. Can I ask you something? Sophie said near the end of the call, her voice hesitant. Anything. The scholarship, the Hale Foundation. You're helping total strangers rebuild their lives. Kids you never met before a few months ago. But you won't call me. Why? Why can strangers get your help and I can't? I sat with that question for a long moment, choosing my words as carefully as I'd ever chosen anything. Because those kids never made me feel invisible, I said quietly. And Sophie, I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that's going to actually help either of us heal from this. I didn't leave you without anything. I left you with everything you needed to learn how to stand on your own, The same way I had to learn it, the same way every person eventually has to learn it. I'm not punishing you by staying away. I'm trying to make sure that when we do rebuild something, it's built on something real. Not on me quietly disappearing into the background of your life again." She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been the entire call. "That's fair," she said. "That's really fair, Dad. I think I needed to hear that." Around 6 months after that call, 6 months of slow, careful, deliberate distance, punctuated by occasional texts, the rare phone call. Small threads of connection. I let Sophie build at her own pace rather than mine. I got an invitation to a community fundraising event, one of those local charity dinners the town held every spring this year, raising money for the same trade school partnership I'd been quietly funding. I almost didn't go. Crowded rooms full of people who'd known Laura and me as a couple for 2 decades felt like walking into a minefield of pitying looks and awkward small talk. But Martin talked me into it mostly by pointing out that several of my apprentices, including Marcus, would be there, and that showing up mattered more than avoiding discomfort. I stood near the back of that ballroom nursing a glass of water, watching Marcus proudly show his mother the certificate marking the completion of his first apprenticeship phase when I felt someone approach beside me. Laura. She looked different than I remembered, thinner, more tired, but there was something steadier in her eyes than I'd seen in years. Something that looked almost like clarity earned the hard way. "Richard," she said quietly. "Laura." We stood there for a moment in silence, watching the room full of people who had no idea they were standing near the wreckage and rebuilding of a 24-year marriage. "I wanted to say something to you," she said finally. "I've been wanting to say it for months, and I kept losing my nerve." "Go ahead." She turned to face me fully, and I could see her hands shaking slightly, could see the effort it was taking her to say whatever she'd come prepared to say. "I was wrong," she said simply. "Not just about the trip, about all of it. I spent years assuming you'd always be there no matter what I did, no matter how I treated your place in this family, because you always had been. I mistook your loyalty for something that would never run out. I was wrong, Richard. I am so sorry." I looked at her for a long moment, feeling the weight of 24 years pressing between us heavier and lighter all at once. "Thank you for saying that," I said honestly. "It means something. It really does." "Is there any chance?" she started, then stopped herself, shaking her head. "No. I'm not asking you to come back. I know that's not fair, and I know it's not what you want. And honestly, Richard, I don't think it's what I want either. Not really. I think I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I threw away. I wanted you to hear that from me, even if it doesn't change anything." "It changes something," I said quietly. "It doesn't change what happened, but it changes how I remember it." She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly, and for a moment standing there in that crowded ballroom, we weren't ex-spouses navigating an awkward encounter. We were just 2 people who had built something together for a long time, acknowledging honestly and without agenda exactly how it had fallen apart. Across the room, I saw Sophie watching us standing near the dessert table, with a plate she wasn't eating from her eyes, moving between her mother and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When our eyes met, she offered a small, uncertain smile, and I found myself smiling back, something loosening in my chest that had been tight for the better part of a year. Laura touched my arm gently before walking away. "Take care of yourself, Richard. I mean that." "You too, Laura." I watched her walk back toward Sophie, watched the 2 of them stand close together, watched Sophie say something quietly that made Laura laugh softly through what still looked like tears. And I stood there at the back of that ballroom alone, but somehow not lonely, understanding for the first time in nearly a year that maybe this careful, honest, imperfect distance was its own kind of healing. Later that night, walking to my truck in the parking lot, I heard footsteps behind me, quick, familiar. "Dad, wait." I turned around. Sophie was jogging toward me, her heels clicking against the pavement, her face flushed from the cold spring air. "I wanted to catch you before you left," she said, slightly out of breath. "I saw you talking to Mom." "We're figuring some things out," I said carefully. "Slowly. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. Dad, can I ask you something? Something real. Of course. She was quiet for a moment, gathering courage. Do you regret it? Selling the house, leaving the way you did. Sometimes I think about that morning, about the text I sent you, and I hate myself for it. I hate that I'm the reason all of this happened. I looked at my daughter, 23 years old now, standing in a parking lot with tears in her eyes, asking a question I'd asked myself 100 times over the last several months in the quiet dark of that cabin, staring out over water that had become the only steady thing in my world. No, I said honestly. I don't regret it. Her face fell slightly, like she'd been hoping for a different answer. Sophie, I said gently, I don't regret it because it wasn't about you sending one text message. It was about 24 years of a truth I refused to see until that moment forced me to see it. If that message hadn't come, I probably would have kept disappearing for another 24 years, right up until there was nothing left of me to disappear. But you lost everything, she whispered. No, I said, shaking my head slowly. I didn't lose everything. I lost a house. I lost a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered long before that text message arrived. But I found something too, Sophie. I found out what it feels like to be chosen by people because they want to be near me, not because they need something from me. I found out I could build something new, even at 57, even sick, even scared. Her eyes widened slightly. Sick. I hesitated, then nodded slowly. The Parkinson's. It's still early stage, still manageable. But it's there, and it's not going anywhere, and I've had to learn how to build a life around that truth, too. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me tighter than she had in years, and I felt her shaking slightly against my chest. I want to be there, she said, her voice muffled against my jacket. For whatever comes next. I know I don't deserve to ask that after everything. But I want to try, Dad. I want to actually show up the way you always did for me. I held her for a long moment in that parking lot, feeling something in my chest that had been clenched tight for the better part of a year, finally slowly beginning to loosen. Then show up, I said quietly. Not because you feel guilty, not because you're scared of losing me too. Show up because you want to, one honest day at a time. That's all I've ever really wanted from anyone. She nodded against my chest, and for the first time since that morning 6 months earlier, standing in a kitchen with a broken coffee mug and a suitcase I never got to pack into a car, I let myself believe that maybe slowly, carefully, something real was beginning to rebuild itself. But healing, I was about to learn, is rarely a straight line. And there was still one conversation left, to have one that would test everything Sophie and I had just started to repair. The conversation Sophie and I still needed to have came sooner than I expected, and it came from a direction I hadn't prepared for at all. 3 weeks after that night in the parking lot, my phone rang at nearly midnight. I almost let it go half asleep until I saw Sophie's name on the screen, and something instinctive in me sat straight up in bed before I even answered. Sophie. Dad. Her voice was wrecked, breathless, like she'd been crying for a long time before she finally dialed. Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be angry, and I know that's a lot to ask, but I don't know who else to call. My heart was already pounding. I'm here. Tell me. Nathan and I had a huge fight tonight. She said, the words tumbling out fast. He found out I've been talking to you again. Really talking, not just texting. And Dad, he said something to me. Something so ugly. And I don't even know how to repeat it. But I need you to know what kind of person he actually is, because I think I've been protecting an idea of him instead of the actual truth. What did he say, Sophie? She took a shaky breath. He said I was choosing you because you have money. He said the only reason I was rebuilding a relationship with you was because of the scholarship fund, because I saw how the community treated you afterward, like some kind of hero, and he said I was just chasing whatever made me look good. He said I never actually loved him, that I only wanted him around when it was convenient for my image. I sat there in the dark, gripping the phone, feeling something hot and protective rise up in my chest. The same feeling I'd had 14 years ago sitting in that hospital chair for 2 nights straight. "That's not true," I said firmly. "None of that is true, and you know it." "I know," she whispered. "I know it's not true. But Dad, it made me realize something. He's never once, not one single time since he came back into my life, asked me what I actually needed. Not what would make him look good as my father, not what would prove he'd changed. What I actually needed. You always asked me that. Every single time my whole life you asked me what I needed before you ever gave me what you thought I should have." I closed my eyes, feeling tears sting unexpectedly. 21 years of fatherhood suddenly compressed into one aching, grateful moment. "I'm so sorry you're going through this," I said. "Can I come see you?" she asked suddenly. "Not tomorrow. Tonight. I know it's late. I know it's a long drive, but Dad, I don't want to be anywhere near him right now, and I don't have anywhere else that feels safe." I was already reaching for my keys before she finished the sentence. "I'll meet you halfway. There's a diner off Highway 34 open all night. I can be there in 40 minutes. "Okay," she said, her voice cracking with relief. "Okay, I'll leave now." I drove through the dark with my hands steady on the wheel, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not grief, not anger, but purpose. Clean, uncomplicated purpose. My daughter needed me, and for the first time since that morning with the broken mug being needed, didn't feel like disappearing. It felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. She was already sitting in a booth when I arrived, wrapped in an oversized sweater, eyes red and swollen, a cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched sitting untouched in front of her. I slid into the seat across from her, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. I just reached across the table and took her hand, the way I used to when she was small and scared of something in the dark. "I'm here," I said quietly. "Talk to me." And she did. For nearly 2 hours in that empty diner at 1 in the morning, Sophie told me everything, not just about the fight that night, but about the slow, quiet disappointments that had been accumulating for months, the ones she'd been too embarrassed, too guilty, too invested in the fantasy of a reunited father to admit even to herself. Missed calls, broken promises. A man who had spent 21 years absent, and instead of using the time since his return to actually learn who his daughter had become, had spent it performing fatherhood for an audience, for photographs, for the applause of strangers online who had no idea what the man behind the captions actually looked like up close. "I think I wanted so badly for it to be real," she said quietly, wrapping both hands around her cold coffee cup. "Because if it wasn't real, then what did that say about me? What did it say about the fact that I chose him over you, even for one trip?" "It says you're human," I said gently. "It says you wanted to believe in something. There's no shame in that, Sophie." "There's shame in what it cost you," she said, her eyes filling again. "Dad, you sold the house. You lost 24 years of your life. And for what? Because I wanted a fantasy to be real." I shook my head slowly. "You didn't cost me anything, Sophie. I want you to really hear that. What happened that morning wasn't caused by you sending one text message. It was the final piece of a truth that had been building for a long, long time, a truth I needed to see whether that message ever came or not. You were the catalyst. You weren't the cause." She wiped her eyes and looked at me for a long moment. Something shifting behind her expression. Something that looked like a weight finally settling into a place where she could actually carry it. "I broke up with him tonight," she said quietly. "Before I called you, I told him I was done. Not because of the money comment, though, that certainly didn't help. Because I finally understood something standing in that kitchen while he yelled at me. I understood that a title was never going to be enough for me. I already had a father who showed up for 21 years. I don't need a stranger performing the role." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just squeezed her hand across that diner table, feeling something in my chest crack open in the best possible way. "I'm proud of you," I said finally. "Not because of who you chose, because of how honestly you got there." We sat in that diner until nearly 3 in the morning talking about everything and nothing. Her job, my foundation, the apprentices, I'd been mentoring small ordinary pieces of two lives, slowly finding their way back toward each other. When we finally stood to leave, she hugged me tightly in the parking lot, longer than she had in years. "Can I come stay at the cabin this weekend?" she asked, pulling back to look at me. "I want to see where you've been. I want to understand the life you built without us." "I'd like that," I said. "I'd like that very much." That weekend became the first of many. Sophie started driving out to the lake every other Saturday, sometimes staying the whole weekend, sometimes just for an afternoon. Slowly, carefully rebuilding something neither of us rushed. We didn't talk about the past every visit. Some weekends we just sat on the porch in silence, watching the water, and that silence, unlike the silence of those first lonely weeks after the divorce, felt full instead of empty. Laura and I settled into something quieter too over the following months. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but a kind of mutual respect built on honesty instead of habit. We spoke occasionally about Sophie, about logistics, about small things that needed coordinating. And every conversation was easier than the last, because neither of us was performing anymore. We were just two people who had loved each other imperfectly for a long time, finally learning how to let each other go with something like grace. About a year after that morning with the broken coffee mug, my symptoms had progressed slightly. A tremor in my left hand that I could no longer fully hide, some difficulty. Some mornings getting my body to cooperate the way my mind still expected it to. I won't pretend that part of my life got easier. Some days were hard. Some mornings I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes, just gathering the will to stand, watching my hand shake against the sheets, feeling something like grief for the body I used to have without a second thought. But I wasn't facing it alone anymore, and that made all the difference in the world. Sophie started coming to my neurology appointments, sitting beside me in the waiting room, asking the doctor sharp, specific questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Laura sent a card, unexpectedly, when she heard about the progression, a simple, handwritten note that said only, "Thinking of you. You don't have to carry this alone anymore either." I kept that card in the same wooden box where I kept Sophie's childhood note about the bicycle, the box that had survived everything, the only piece of the old house I'd carried with me into whatever came next. The Hale Foundation grew faster than I ever expected. What started as 6 apprentices became 22 within 18 months, then 40 within 2 years. Kids across 3 counties learning trades they never could have afforded to learn, otherwise building the same kind of life I'd built from nothing at 28 years old, except now with someone standing behind them, believing they could do it. Marcus, the first boy I'd interviewed, the one in the borrowed shirt with shaking hands, completed his full apprenticeship 18 months after we started, and came to me afterward with something I never expected, an offer to buy into my company as a junior partner, using savings he'd built from steady, well-paid work he never would have had access to without the foundation. "Oh, you gave me a chance nobody else would," he told me, standing in my office, 21 years old and steadier than I'd ever seen him. "I want to build something with you, Richard. Not for you. With you." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. 2 years after that morning, with the broken mug standing in the small office of a company that now had a second name on the door, Hale and Reyes Construction, I got a call from Sophie that I'll remember for the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be. "Dad," she said, and I could hear something different in her voice, something bright and nervous and hopeful all at once. "I want you to walk me down the aisle." I sat down slowly in my chair, feeling something enormous move through my chest. "You're getting married. His name is David," she said, laughing through what sounded like happy tears. "He's a teacher. He's kind. Dad, genuinely kind. The kind of kind that shows up even when nobody's watching. I want you to meet him properly this weekend. And Dad, I want you to be the one who walks me down that aisle. Not because it's tradition, because you're my father. You've always been my father." There was never really a question about that. Not really, not once I let myself see clearly. I sat in that office for a long time after we hung up, looking out the window at a construction crew working on a job site across the street, my hand trembling slightly against the desk, feeling something I hadn't let myself fully feel in 2 long years. Not grief, not anger, not even simple relief. Peace. The wedding took place the following spring, on a quiet piece of land outside Fort Collins that Sophie and David had chosen specifically because it reminded her, she told me, of the lake cabin where she'd spent so many weekends rebuilding something precious with her father. I walked her down that aisle with my left hand trembling slightly against her arm, and she held it steady without a word, the same way I had once held her hand steady, learning to ride a bicycle, refusing to let go even when she asked me to. Laura sat in the front row, and when our eyes met during the ceremony, she smiled at me, genuine and unguarded, and I smiled back. And somewhere in that quiet exchange, 24 years of marriage finally fully, gently closed its final chapter, leaving behind something calmer than either of us had expected. Not romance, not regret, just peace earned the hard way. The only way peace is ever really earned. Nathan wasn't there. Sophie told me later she'd sent him an invitation out of politeness, and he'd declined, citing a scheduling conflict. I don't think either of us was surprised. Some men spend their whole lives performing the idea of showing up. Some men simply show up. By then, everyone in that family finally understood the difference. Standing at the edge of that reception later that evening, watching Sophie dance with her new husband, watching Laura laugh with old friends, watching Marcus and my other apprentices mingle easily among guests who had no idea how far some of these young men had come from where they started. I thought about that morning 3 years earlier, the shattered mug, the suitcase I never got to pack, 4 words typed with shaking hands. Enjoy the trip. I won't. I thought about my father standing in that garage decades ago, wiping sawdust off hands that never got quite clean, telling me that a house isn't a home because of the walls. That walls don't choose anything, only people do. I understood now, standing at the edge of my daughter's wedding, with a tremor in my hand and peace in my chest, that he'd been right about something even bigger than he probably realized. It was never really about the house on Larkspur Ridge. It was never about the walls or the furniture or the years I spent building something with my own 2 hands. It was about learning finally, at 57 years old, sick and scared, and utterly alone in a kitchen with a broken coffee mug, that walking away from people who had forgotten my worth wasn't the end of my story. It was the only way I ever could have found my way back to the people who actually valued it, and to the parts of myself I had spent 24 years quietly giving away one invisible sacrifice at a time until there was almost nothing left standing in the frame at all. I didn't lose my family that morning. I found out the hardest way a man can find out exactly who was willing to stay. And in the end, that was worth more than any house I ever built, any title I ever carried, any love I ever gave, without asking for anything back. I am still here, still standing, still finally fully myself. And that is the whole truth of what happened the year they chose someone else's name over mine, and I chose at last to answer to my own.